Hello. Right. Nice to be live. To give a brief introduction, my name is Austin, and I'm joined today with Christy Lynne Wood, who is streaming over from Michigan, over in the States. Hi, Christy.
Hello.
It's awesome to get to speak to you because I saw that you had started your new podcast, Religious Rebels, only a few months ago, or a month or so ago, right?
Yeah, month.
So it's great to actually be speaking to you when both of us have started these channels and want to get to, talk about your upbringing in the IBLP, this Fundamentalist Christian group, and the theology, the practices, the education that you went through as a young person in that group.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes, it'll be good. Yeah.
Awesome. So do you want to just give a brief background to who you are and what your upbringing was like in the IBLP in a nutshell in just a minute or so?
Sure. So I joined the IBLP as a 12-year-old. My family was accepted into their homeschooling program when I was 12. And I spent the next, 6, actually closer to 10 years being heavily influenced by the IBLP and doing their homeschooling curriculum. We attended a church that was very connected with the IBLP. And yeah, that's how it all kind of started. And that's where it started. Yeah.
So it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because you've got both the religious church group, the IBLP, but you've also got like these other acronyms, ATI, right? Which is the homeschooling program, which is connected to the church, but in the same way, it's maybe like a route into the faith. Would that be a good description?
For sure. Yeah,
so did it sort of pick up people on like the fringes of traditionalist Christianity and bring them into Gothard's teaching?
So it started actually, Gothard had the basic seminar and then the advanced seminar. And so the basic seminar was where you would start picking up people who were interested in his teachings. And there's actually a lot of people who have gone to the basic seminar that never got farther involved. So they just went to the basic seminar, maybe once, maybe twice, and that's all. So they were exposed to his teachings, but never got sucked in. And then after that was the advanced seminar, which was like the next step of the whirlpool. And then after that was like the homeschooling program. And so the homeschooling program, you had to be accepted to apply and be accepted. And you had to agree to a whole bunch of rules and you had to pay.
You had to pay as well. Yeah. See, what I picked up when you were talking about that is the word seminar, because seminar almost jumps out at me like this is already something which is trying to be sold. It's like, it's not just like a belief system. It's like a package that you're buying into to think a certain way, to learn about a certain thing, rather than just like being given the book and say, here you go. And then adding on to that with the payment, like that's already like making me think there's some red flags here that we need to like be aware of.
For sure. How about the fact that if you went to the basic seminar and the advanced seminar, you were not allowed to show that material to anybody who hadn't already been there?
Reminds me already about Scientology. Like that's the group that I know the most about, and how these confidential levels of materials that they have access to need to be kept confidential, because it's believed, rightly or wrongly, that these are like word, they are gospel, and unless you pay access, you are not worthy to like have any experience of them, to read them, to understand them, to believe them, which is so almost backward compared to what most faith messages are, which is to go and spread the word because people are deserving of that in virtue of being human.
Yes. Yeah, backwards.
Yeah. So can you just talk, before we get on to maybe some of the theology, a little bit about who Bill Gothard was? Because we mentioned his name a couple of times, but who is this man and what is his background and how did he get into this group and start this group?
Yeah. Well, Bill Gothard is from the Chicago, Illinois area. And he actually started this whole kind of a system, I would say, I think it's in the 60s. So, I mean, I don't have it completely down pat, but I know that he was by the 60s and the 70s, especially, he was doing these seminars. And he originally called it the Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts. And so he was, once again, selling a seminar and promising people that if they followed his steps and his 7 basic principles, that he would be able to promise them success and blessings. And he really connected to kind of the upheaval of the 1960s here in the United States with the civil rights movement and the wars and all this stuff that was happening and the hippie movement. And he just said, if you follow my rules and my steps, I guarantee that none of this bad stuff is going to affect you, that you will be safe, that I can protect you. And he really played on that fear. But then his seminars just grew. I mean, they say like millions of people have attended his seminars over the years. And so then by the 1980s, he was starting to play with the idea of a homeschool program. And
Yeah.
then into this homeschool program, and the seminars continued through the 90s into the early 2000s. And it's still around. It's just much smaller than it used to be.
Yeah. And I guess the 60s to the 80s, that move, like that period of time, especially in the States, what you have, like, you know, obviously post Second World War, you have the baby boomer generation, then you have obviously Vietnam, the civil rights movement, everything like that. There's a lot of political upheaval, and a lot of people naturally like searching for something and seeking something that was new and fresh, because for whatever reason they may have thought that their community or their faith system wasn't right for them at that time in that political turmoil. So you see not just Gothard, but you see loads of other groups. Jehovah's Witnesses started booming at that time as well. You had Scientology grew out of the 50s into the 60s. Other new religious movements, Moonies, etc. They were all growing at this time because of that seeking nature, right?
Yeah, I think so. And one of the IBLP slogan was, like you said, giving the world a new approach to life. That was their slogan. So tying right in with that, like, I'm looking for this new thing.
Yeah, something new. And I guess a lot of the things about the IBLP, especially at the start, I know Gothard now isn't involved in the organization despite him being still alive and quite elderly, right?
Yes. Yes. He's been kicked out.
Booted out, yeah, for like PR reasons, perhaps, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
All of the sexual
So
harassment charges didn't go over well.
yeah, we'll talk about that later as well, because there seems to be a lot of things about that and like how that faith is lived out, which is obviously horrific. So initially, there's a lot of like authority with him, a lot of authority with like the men of the house, right? Being the husband, the umbrella that shields
Mhm.
the wife and the children underneath, right? So how do you move as someone who still has a faith and a Christian faith from placing your authority on him and the maybe other influential authority figures in your life to then finding scripture being maybe authoritative in a way that you didn't previously?
Yeah, so I think this kind of ties into my story. So I was
Yeah,
fully enveloped in the IBLP cult at age 15.
yeah,
I was doing all the things. I wanted to be a good girl. I wanted to be godly. I wanted people to like me. And so I was trying super hard to be good and
yeah,
follow the rules. And then I unexpectedly, and I can't explain it, I can't tell you why it happened or how it happened, but I unexpectedly had a spiritual experience where I felt
mm,
like I came face to face with a presence that I didn't understand, but felt to be, I was like, I think this is God. I want to know God. If this is God, I want to know him. And so began pursuing my own relationship with God, reading the Bible for myself, praying to him for myself. And that was what started my journey thinking, I don't know if the things that Gothard is teaching, if the things that my Gothard church is teaching are really right,
mm,
because the things that I'm reading in scripture for myself and the God that I've gotten to know is not the same God or the same truth that they're teaching. And so I would say
mm,
that's what really started me going, I don't know about this. I don't know if this is really
yeah.
real. And so starting to, like you said, take my own authority from scripture versus from a man and from people and from a teaching like that. So yeah, that
Yeah.
was kind of the start of it all.
And that's quite common for a lot of people when we think about new religious movements or high control groups, because it starts off with like a seed or an experience that just plants in your mind, and it doesn't like open the whole book. It doesn't like give you this tidal wave of realization and say everything's wrong about what I've thought and known for my entire life or 10 years, however long you've been in this group. It's something small which then starts to begin to unravel over time with the more discovery and experiences you have, right?
Yeah. And I would say over the next 4 years would be as things just began to unravel. So as a 15-year-old, feeling like I just met Jesus, and then, until I was 19 when I started asking questions and being like, "Why do we do this? Why is
Yeah,
this something that we do? Why is this a rule? Why is, and getting kind of becoming that rebel, I guess you could say.
Yeah,
Yep.
that
So yeah,
rebel, because
journey, a
that
journey.
that's the name of your book, right? Religious Rebels. Yeah. Why did you choose that title?
I chose it because I am kind of in this place right now where you talked about this a little bit in my faith journey, but and I think we'll talk about this more, but
Yeah.
I'm not I'm not just sticking to one side or the other. So I'm rebelling against, these rules and these religious formulas and all the stuff of my fundamentalist past. But many people who leave that kind of a background tend to jump right to a more liberal progressive mindset, but they
Yeah.
have the same black and white ideology. So they still tend to think I'm right, we're right, everyone else is wrong. And so I guess I'm kind of rebelling against that as well. Like I don't want to just jump into some other ideology that's just as black
Yeah.
and white and just as like, we're right and you're wrong. And so to be a rebel is something that used to be considered so terrible in the IBLP. Like
Yeah.
it was like the worst thing you could be called as a rebel. And yet for me, it's something that I've just embraced. Like I am a rebel and I'm not
Yeah.
joining a side. I'm not joining a group. I'm just going to follow Jesus.
And that's totally fine. And I don't see why people should be so polarized on this issue, right? It's
Right?
not like, there's this one truth or there is this false truth. Like, we can't speak for anyone else in their own experience of faith. And I think it would be really ignorant to try and do so. It's why I'm in my sort of like ideology, I'd be quite universalist or pluralist because I'm not going to say what's right or wrong. And I can't be sure. I never will be until I'm eventually in front of maybe someone at the pearly gates or not, right? Um,
Right.
so let's not judge people based on that, and let's not be so polarizing. You use the word deconstructing Christianity as well when you speak about this. What do you mean by deconstructing in that way?
Well, I don't know how it is over in England or in Europe, but in here in America, we have a whole movement of deconstructionist, and a lot of it
Yeah,
is pushing back against the evangelical um, framework and stuff like that.
yeah,
And many people feel like deconstructing automatically lands you at a certain place. Once again, polarized. And like if you
mm,
deconstruct, you're going to end up here. And other people are kind of condemning deconstruction and saying, like, don't go down that path. It means you're going to end up as an atheist or you're going to end up as an agnostic. And I use the term deconstruction because in other definitions of it, it just means to take something apart to its individual pieces. And so for me to deconstruct my faith has meant that I've taken it apart to its individual pieces and I've, then put it back together again as a new type of faith. But so I like to use the term deconstruction because to me it just means that taking apart process. And I want people who are rethinking their faith to
yeah,
maybe have a different option. So like if you look up deconstruction, often you get this one, like you can end up here and that's it. And I want them to
mm.
know there's other options. Like you don't have to end up just in this one spot. You could reconstruct a
Right.
faith that's orthodox and historical if you want to.
And what I quite like about the word is that it's accepting the fact that deconstructing is active. It's a verb. Like it's something that you do, and it's not just like a process with just a set end goal. It's a thinking process that is
Yes.
going to change with how you experience faith, how you experience or the Bible, scripture, like what you read and who you interact with. It shouldn't be so polarizing because again, it's something that's individual, right? It's a
Right.
process.
It's a process. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I had another question to do with theology, going back to what we were talking about, maybe with this umbrella sort of imagery of
Yeah.
sort of this patriarch of the house or the patriarch being Gothard in the IBLP. But with those very traditional gender roles, what were the views towards women in scripture and women in the Bible?
Um, it was twisted or forgotten or ignored. So, in the Bible, there's a judge named Deborah, and she's from
Yeah.
Judges, and she was a woman who was in leadership, but they were very quick to condemn that and say the only reason she could be in leadership was that there was no good men. There was no men who could be in leadership. So we don't want to be like Deborah. And that's something that was, just very condemned. There's a prophetess named Huldah who shows up in one of the king's books, and we just ignored her. She didn't exist, and you asked about like the Virgin Mary, and she was just kind of, we talked about her a little bit, but we didn't really talk about any leadership. So it was just, you emphasized the sweetness and the submission and her submission to God's will and stuff like that. So any woman with any kind of a leadership gift was just either twisted or ignored. So yeah, we didn't
How
talk about the
strange,
matriarchs of the faith.
how strange though, isn't it? Like, people like pick up on the submission, the sort of following nature of these women, rather than the wisdom, the leadership, the other authority that they have. Albeit there may be fewer in the Bible, women are not forgotten. They are there. It's interesting to see how different groups have obviously picked up on that or chosen to forget or silence those voices.
Oh, absolutely. And when you think about the patriarchal like culture that the Bible was written in, and then you think
Mm.
about the women who are like entered into the Bible anyway, that just shows the very different nature that God has towards women. Like he was making sure they were included. He was making sure these women were, talked about in a culture that would have ignored them.
And that's now being picked up on, thankfully, I think more so in the theological circles, where we're starting to start to remember these forgotten voices. The unseen women is often the term, isn't it? They're not seen or they're unheard, but they're still there. And we need to just think about that in the context of this historical document, in this historical text. The Bible wasn't written in 2024. It was written 2000 years ago, even earlier than that. And we have to realize that if we're going to then use that as a living piece of faith in the modern time.
Absolutely.
So that leads on to another question, which would then lead on some things about education, because I know we talk briefly about like the homeschooling aspect of the IBLP and the ATI, the Advanced Training Institute. So I was reading up and seeing that the homeschooling curriculum comes through is like wisdom booklets. Is that the correct term?
That is the correct
Based
term.
on the Sermon on the Mount. So how true do you think it is that these booklets are actually based on the virtues that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount?
Not at all. So the wisdom booklets, they were portrayed as if you use these for your curriculum, that you would have the equivalent of a bachelor's degree in science and a bachelor's degree
Yeah.
in health and all this stuff, supposedly. But if you look at them, they were actually being written by students themselves that were working at the Institute at headquarters. They were being put together by people who really had no business putting together material like that. So much of the stuff has been just debunked. It's not even true, especially in the science and even some of the history that we were taught, completely false. And then as far as teachings that Jesus actually talked about, we were using a King James version, so it's archaic language.
Yeah.
And just so much of it was twisted into what Gothard wanted it to mean. And so
Mm.
I was thinking about this question for you, and there's a passage in Matthew 6:22 and 23, and it's talking about if your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. And Gothard
Mm.
took that literally in English and decided that if you had bright, shiny eyes, that meant you were a wonderful person full of the Spirit of God. But if your
Right.
eyes were dark, if he could see darkness in your eyes, then you were rebellious and you were, against God or whatever. And just recently, I came across someone who was teaching about this, and that having a good eye is actually a Jewish idiom for being a generous person.
Oh, really?
Yes. And so, which makes sense because if you look at the passage, it's sandwiched in between two different things that are talking about money and giving
Mm.
and having your treasures on heaven instead of it in earth. And so it totally makes sense that it would be about the same thing since it's flowing right through there. But he took that and
Yeah.
twisted it in a whole different direction. And it should always have been about like, if you're a generous person, then you're going to have light in your life. You're going to feel happy and you're going to be somebody who's, joyful, not.
Not just people with nice eyes that you get like
Yeah,
enamored.
exactly.
Like, yeah, how strange is that? It's like, again, it's another example of how the authority figure in a high controlling group will take something and then reinforce it through like an education program. Like
Yeah.
how how simple, dare I say, for like Gothard to use a homeschooling program where you're already sort of away from any potential influence in the fact that you're being homeschooled, so you're within a circle of people who are reinforcing beliefs, to then use that to reinforce his own fundamentalist Christian beliefs on children.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this, again, idea that Gothard, you can sort of just trust him, because if you don't have to worry about what the right thing to do is, right? He will have the answer, and it would be part of maybe the wisdom booklets. It would be part of the seminar that you're paying for, and you will be able to get what you need out of this pathway, right?
Right.
How did that reliance on authority shape your upbringing?
My family was kind of a fringe family, so we never bought into the whole thing completely. In fact, my dad was a public school teacher the entire time we were in the program. So that's a whole different experience. Um, and so we never thought of him as somebody who was God's spokesperson, but there were people who did. And so I know families who thought that he was literally speaking from God. And my family was always like, "Al, I don't know. He is a man. Like, he could be wrong," kind of a thing. So that was
Yeah,
helpful for me and my experience. I
yeah,
think that's probably part of why I've been able to process everything as best as I have been able to. But yeah, so just having, I mean, he went away every year and fasted supposedly for 40 days and 40 nights and came back with words from God, which, some
nice.
they got weirder and weirder the older he got. But yeah, that's where he got his, his wisdom and his words from God, supposedly was this. Yeah, and so if you believed that, if you really believed that he was hearing from God, if you believed that he was the person who could speak to you from God, there's a lot of sketchy things that you get sucked into.
Oh yeah, I can imagine so, right?
Yeah.
And what about like community then? You said you were on the fringes, and like I guess having your father be a public school teacher, that was maybe a nice little like step out of the circle in some ways. You always had that connection with I guess community that wasn't in his faith community.
Yeah.
How was that growing up? Was that quite like, in reflection, quite like helpful for you when you deconstruct Christianity, or when you were questioning for yourself?
Yeah, I think having parents who weren't completely 100% on board was really helpful, although there was a good period of time where they even thought that I was wrong and crazy because I was like, that's wrong, and he's wrong," and everyone's like, "Stop being so judgmental." And,
Mm,
so there was a time when they thought that I was just going off the deep end. But yeah, I think having that people who weren't buying into it completely was helpful. I would say for me, it was actually the church that was probably the worst brainwashing that happened to me versus the curriculum itself. So
mm,
my experience with Gothard and with IBLP, homeschooling wise, was not great, but not terrible. But we were
yeah,
part of this church where everybody who went to that church was in ATI or trying to get into ATI or like
yeah,
ATI adjacent. And so, and that church, the youth group in that church and the youth leader in that church, I would say that's probably where the most damaging of the brainwashing happened. So that was community that I was trying to fit in with, community that I was
mm,
trying to have them think well of me, and definitely got a lot of, I think, the stuff my parents were trying to keep away from me. I got that, like, just full force from them.
probably as well because you were a young woman who was keen to be good and keen to impress and keen to fit in, probably, right? So
Oh,
when you're
absolutely.
around other people with that ideology, especially one that is quite extremist, you're going to buy into it more because you want that praise, you want that feeling of safety, you want that feeling of affirmation.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's interesting how I never really felt like I fit in. So my
Yeah.
personality is very strong. I
Mm,
have a lot of leadership skills. I'm pretty much like, don't mind just telling you how it is. And that was not how women are supposed to be. And so my first 3 years in the cult church, like I tried so hard to pretend to be somebody different. And I tried
yeah,
so hard to copy the other girls and to talk in a quiet little voice like this, and to be this like sweet person. And it's just not who I am. Like, I mean, I think I'm a nice person, but I'm not sweet. And so it
yeah.
was just really, really hard to, try to be that person that, like you said, feel like I fit in and to be accepted and to not feel there's something wrong with me because I felt like that there's something wrong with me. I can't do this.
Yeah. And how traumatic is that, especially as a young person? You're trying to process everything that goes on in a young person's mind about how you're developing, how you fit in. And one of the basic needs that everyone has, adult or child, is this desire for community, because it makes us as humans, these social animals, feel like we're interlinked with people. So when you've got that community and you feel like you don't fit in, like that is going to really like shape you and shape your thinking processes in a way that isn't always going to be very healthy, right?
Oh yeah. And it didn't help that everyone started getting married really young. So there were
Mm,
girls that were getting married courting. So parent
yeah,
arranged marriage basically. Courting and then getting married like before they even graduated from high school. And
really.
nobody wanted me. Like nobody wanted me. So I was like, "Oh, I'm just left out here." But now I see it as protection. I feel like God was protecting me from, a really unhealthy young marriage and fundamentalism.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
yeah, the same
And
thing, just feeling sad.
and there must be some like feeling of guilt almost, because you're saying like, why am I not being chosen? Why is God not helping me here? Like, what am I doing wrong? And you're then going to be set in this spiral of thought, because if you place your authority on your group and you place your authority on like these leaders, then every little thing that isn't going right, you're probably thinking, what's wrong with me?
Well, and we were taught that way. Like, we were taught if things go bad, it's your fault. Like, you did something. Like, you should go back in your life and figure out where you sinned. Go back and figure out what steps you didn't follow. Go back and figure out, where you messed up so that you're being judged. Yeah.
So one of the things that obviously is so interesting about the IBLP again is the relationships aspect. So what was it like? Yeah, you mentioned this courting sort of idea. What was that like for young people, men and women, growing up in your church?
So it's interesting because Gothard really didn't encourage his young people to get married. He wanted them to stay single and keep working at his headquarters and his other um,
Mm,
training centers for free. And so he could just keep using them and,
yeah,
doing things with the girls. But in my church, it just was like people just started getting married really young. And I'm so glad that it didn't happen to me now, like looking back on it. But at the
yeah,
time, it was just like if somebody had a crush on somebody, the parents would get together and be like, "Oh, I think this person's supposed to marry your daughter." Oh, okay. And so they would
yeah.
just basically arrange these marriages. And then you just found out that you were courting this person, but you were basically already engaged at that point. I mean, you could break off a courtship, but it was real hard. So you found out this person wants to court me. Okay, I guess I'm courting them. It's God's will. My dad said it was God's will. And so you jump into this relationship where you can't be alone, you can't touch each other, you can't I mean, there's the list of rules was ridiculous. And then
Mm,
you're expected to get married and be a wife, be a husband,
wow.
which you're 18.
And how did that process happen? Was it that like sort of one family would maybe know another family who might have some influence or power, and they thought, well, maybe we could set up our daughter with this son, and then we might, be able to strengthen our ties, or God will see that. What was that process like?
It's a good question. I don't know what went through some of the parents' heads. Like, I think sometimes that happened. I think sometimes it was more just like one of the boys would start thinking one of the girls was cute. Like, I just like, "Oh,
Yeah,
she's cute. I'd like to marry her." And so he would talk to his dad, and his dad would be like, "Okay, I'll go talk to her dad." And the dads would arrange it. And
yeah,
then the girl didn't really have an option. I mean, she just was like, "This man came to you. It must be God's will. So here you go. You're in this relationship." And if she was lucky, she liked him already. And if she didn't, you hopefully would learn to like each other.
yeah. Learn to like. How rough is that though? It's like, you have to learn to like it, because otherwise you're going to be just like looked down upon. You're going to be rejected, almost like just,
And I
yeah.
mean,
Again,
then you're
that
gonna start
guilt.
having babies right away too, because you mentioned that, but, like, they don't
Yeah.
believe in birth control. So you're 19, you're 18, you're 17, and now you're pregnant and married and popping out babies every year and not healthy. It's not healthy.
No, not at all. Not least for your body at that age. But that links on to this idea, because the IBLP and the Quiverful movement share a lot of ties, right? And it's this idea
Yeah.
that the more children you have, the more blessed you are, because God is blessing you with a child. So go out, be fruitful and multiply, to the extreme. Hence why we've got
Yes.
obviously the Duggar family, who made their way into popular culture through 16 kids and counting, then going on 17, 18, 19, and how many of these children. What was that like growing up around people who were obviously having children at a young age, and this expectation that you should be having children as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think my family only had 3 kids, and so we were
Mm,
very much the outsiders in that we just drove a regular old minivan, but so many of the people coming to this church had, 8, 10, 12 kids. And so
wow.
I experienced it through my friends. So I had a lot of friends who were the oldest daughter in a family like this, and I experienced it through them. And I saw, like, right away that I didn't want to do this because I saw mothers who were completely not okay. Like, their mental state was a mess. They were a wreck. Their physical bodies weren't okay. And so my friends were running the family. Like, I had friends who
Wow.
were literally cooking and taking care of kids and homeschooling, and they were like 16. But mom is in
Yeah.
bed because mom can't function, or she's pregnant, or she's just had a baby. And so the oldest daughter is having to take over, or maybe the oldest 2 daughters if you're lucky. And so I saw that and I watched that happen and I was like, this is terrible. I watched middle kids. So you're the middle kid and 8 kids, you're the middle kid and 10 kids, and you're just no one notices you. Like,
Yeah.
you're just in the mix. And I saw these kids who were just they were just broken and they were hurting and no one had time for them. And I was
Yeah.
like, "This is not okay." Like, there's something seriously wrong to this. And I don't think I ever bought into that. Um,
Yeah.
I don't think I ever bought into that. So that was one of those things right away that I was like, "This is not true." So, like
Mm.
I said, I'm kind of a skeptic and I'm kind of discerning and I'm kind of like too strong for my own good, at least in IBLP. And so it's just like, I don't think that's true. Yeah.
So how did that maybe then affect your view of parenting? You said you had children, right? Like, how did you ever
Yeah.
see like the bad examples of parenting and think like, I've
Oh,
got to
yeah.
definitely do it right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think I didn't realize how much it affected my parenting till I had kids. And then I started
Mm.
realizing how much was still there, like how much of the way I viewed children and how children should behave and um, just how that was still there. Even though I was rejecting it, it was still a part of that. And yeah, I only have 2 kids. So that would have, I'm a really bad person right now, Austin. I have short hair, I
Oh,
work, I
really?
have 2 children.
Yeah, how dare you? How dare you? What are you doing with your
Yeah.
free time? You should be having more kids. Come on.
I'm working. I'm working outside the home, which is also bad.
Yeah.
But, I think that I've always loved kids, and I think if I'd gotten married earlier and, we had some problems having kids right away, and so I think I probably would have had maybe 4, but that
Yeah.
would've been like, "That's a big family and I'm done." And so my
Yeah.
2 kids that I have, are great, and I'm glad I have them. But there was guilt. I'll tell you, like, when I decided I was done having kids, like, I definitely felt guilt, like, "Is it okay to be done? Is it
Yeah.
okay to say we're done?" Mhm.
How strange? Yeah, how strange, because 2 kids is a handful. I'm sure, yeah, amazing to have children, but still, like, you don't need 19 to be a great parent. You don't need 19 to please God, I'm sure. So long as you're a great person. What's God to say that that's wrong?
I think I
So
definitely still have, a little bit of a there's still a trigger there. So if I see people with lots of kids,
yeah,
I automatically am like, "Do you wanna have kids? Like, are you having these because you want to have them, or are you doing it because you think you have to?" So,
yeah.
yeah.
It's like that expectation versus desire sort of thing, isn't it? It's like, I don't necessarily want to do this, but I'm doing it because I'm expected to, because the people around me are doing it. If I don't, then I feel cut out. So, it's sad when it comes down to big life choices, but even the little choices that happen within high control groups do really play with people's minds, often
For sure.
in very like subconscious ways for years after even they leave.
Mhm. Yep.
So, one thing again about parenting would be then to go on to talk a little bit about the abuse that happens in the IBLP as a result of the beliefs, teaching, and the theology. So, physical discipline has been taught by the IBLP. Um, how was that portrayed when you were growing up, um, whether in your own family or in the children you knew?
Yeah. So, I mean, my family, they spanked, but it wasn't the same kind of spanking. It was kind of like the old-fashioned spanking, like when it was
Yeah,
just I don't know. And they didn't spank us past a certain age. Like, we were little kids and they stopped spanking us. And so I don't think that was abusive at all. I don't feel like that was a problem at all. But the church, like when I watched, have you watched Shiny Happy People on Amazon?
Yeah, I watched it in this past week just so I got a bit of
Okay.
background before talking to you. And what was quite shocking was like a video of one of the church leaders practicing almost on a child, and I was like, what is going on here?
When I watched that with my husband, I suddenly realized that I had witnessed the blanket training they were talking about with babies. Like, I saw that happen. Like, I watched that happen. I watched people smack their babies until they stopped trying to climb off the blanket. And
Really?
that was traumatic for me. I mean, like, I'm in my 40s and I was like, "Oh no." Like, I watched abuse and I kind of had forgotten that. Your mind doesn't always remember all these things, and I was like, I saw that happen. And I mean, I know I saw kids that were spanked way past when they should have been spanked. And, we're going to spank you until you're happy. We're going to spank you, like you said on that video. We're going to spank you
Yeah.
until you're, have a good attitude or whatever. And not in my own personal family, but absolutely at the church. Absolutely.
So then how were claims of abuse handled within the church and the organization? Was it a matter of, well, if you're speaking out and you're saying that something's wrong, then you're a victim and that is also wrong because you're bringing us down?
Yeah.
What was the attitude, but also what was the structural practice that happened within the church?
Yeah. There wasn't any. I mean, there was one family that I remember, and it was a big deal. Like, it must have been some pretty horrific abuse. Because there was one family where she left him, and that did not happen. I mean, that did not happen. And her kids were like, I mean, it was a mess. They ended up having to be taken away for foster care, and I mean, it was bad. But even that wasn't handled well. Like, it was like one of those things where, like, well, the pastor will go talk to him and try to get him to stop doing, beating his wife and kids. But it wasn't handled well. But it really comes down to Gothard's 7 basic principles. So besides authority, like you talked about, he also had principles on responsibility, which is basically like you're responsible for everything that happens to you. There was principles of ownership, where you have to take, once again, ownership for the things that you've done. Don't push blame on anybody else. And then suffering, where you were basically like you're being blessed because you're suffering. And so when you have those twisted views, you don't speak up about your own abuse, because you're like, well, the authority's in charge and I need to take responsibility for the things that I'm doing wrong to cause this, and I need to suffer well, and I mean, it's a mess.
Yeah.
And Gothard did that on purpose. I mean, he purposefully, in my opinion, I can't prove it, but I think he purposely created these systems where he could get away with whatever he wanted to, and nobody
Really?
could stop him because of these principles that he's put into place.
Yeah, and you're reinforcing that because you're saying to the person, like, it's your responsibility, you've been abused, don't come crying to me, you did this. Like,
Right.
and when you're saying that to vulnerable people who are under a lot of influence and coercion, that is obviously going to be traumatic, and it's going to put someone who is a narcissist or a manipulator like Gothard was into that position. It's so dangerous.
Yes, and I would say that Gothard's teachings attracted people who were already abusive and were already narcissistic, because it gave them that place to be able to just practice without any accountability. And so I know, I mean, my family was healthy. We were in a cult, but we were healthy-ish,
Good.
Dysfunctional, obviously we're all dysfunctional, but like there were some people in my church that were very unhealthy. And
Yeah.
it just attracted those kinds of people because you had all this power suddenly.
Yeah. And that's the thing, isn't it? Because you've got high control groups, cults or whatever, and they can obviously attract anybody. It doesn't matter about whether you're a man, woman, you are rich, poor, whatever community you're from, whatever intelligence level, if there's such a thing that you have, it can draw in anybody. But also you see this predisposition for people who have a narcissistic ideology or a narcissistic or psychopathic sort of view on the world, find their way like very nicely into these groups because they reaffirm this authority, this control that you get when you're either in a position of leadership or you're even in just a position within your community or your family unit, which gives you that thrive for whatever that narcissist wants.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what about some of the allegations regarding Gothard then. Can you speak about what they were and his sort of fall from grace, if you will?
So about 11 years ago, I think is when my son was, now he's almost 10. So he's almost 12. Maybe it was 12 years ago. Um,
Mm.
there was a group that started an online website, and it was called recoveringgrace.org. And it was run by students like me, and they published people's stories. And so we were starting to talk about what happened to us in ATI at the training centers with Gothard. And that's when some of these first stories began to come out. So girls saying like he was inappropriate. He touched me strangely, like things happened. He had me in his office late at night, just the two of us. And he was going against everything he taught. I mean, if any young man had treated a woman like that at his training center, he would have been gone. I mean, gone.
Yeah.
But he could just do whatever he wanted to do. And so these stories started coming out. And I mean, I think there's probably 8 to 10 that are published on the website right now at recoveringgrace.org. But there's more. My
Yeah.
sister-in-law's sister was groomed by him, and she never told her
Mm.
story. But the same things happened to her. And so
Yeah.
and I knew as a 12-year-old going to my first conference in Knoxville, Tennessee, I knew that Gothard had a type. And I could literally tell
Mm.
my friend, "Look, those are some Gothard girls over there. Look at that Gothard girl." Like, we knew he had a type. We just didn't know what it meant. And so he collected these vulnerable girls. He did a really good job at finding people who had been abused or already
Mm.
had a home situation where they weren't feeling loved and taken care of. He's a predator. He knew exactly who to grab. And so he would say, "Oh, you're so beautiful. Your eyes are so bright and shiny. Like you should come work at
Yeah.
my training center for me." And so that was a huge just, Gothard wants me? Like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm gonna go, like it was huge. And so
Yeah.
he would draw these girls in and he would just play with them. I mean, I think most of them never went too far, quote unquote. There's a couple girls who claim that things have happened. And I'm not saying that they didn't. I'm sure they did. But like most of them, he could just kind of say, well, that wasn't really anything. That was just a mistake on their part. Like they understood that differently than I did. But we were so sexually naive. We had no idea what was sexual and what wasn't sexual. And
No.
so we're like, oh, he's trying to treat me like a nice grandpa. Okay, no, grandpas don't do that.
Yeah.
And so,
No.
there's all these girls that came forward. They tried to do a lawsuit against him, but statute of limitations was up. And then he
Mm.
came back kind of to countersued them for defamation. And they were able to go in and just really get him for that he was, there was no defamation there. He was wrong. And that's kind of
Yeah.
as far as it's gone to my knowledge. But yeah,
Yeah.
statute of
And
limitations,
that's
and
the
he's
sad.
85 now and senile. So
Yeah. Well, it's the nature, sadly, isn't it? Where historic cases of abuse are so hard to prove that unfortunately a lot of victims will never get the justice that they deserve. But they're the ones ultimately who know the truth. It's just why it's again so important that we have opportunities like this where we get to talk about what happened to you, or talk about anyone's experience within these groups, whether that's through the blog that you mentioned with the abuse survivors coming out, or whether it's through YouTube or even just in person, right? I think the more people that are talking about this, the more likely we are to safeguard people in the future.
I agree.
Yeah. So if you were then, and to wrap this up with one final question, because we're going on near 45 minutes now, which is great. If you were to speak to someone now who had the same beliefs, the fundamentalist beliefs, the IBLP core at their heart, what would you ask them as well, this one question, and why would you ask it?
So I was thinking about this question, and I think what I would ask them is I would ask them if they'd be willing, would you be willing to look up the verses that Gothard uses to support his points and
Mm.
read them in context with surrounding verses in a different translation? Would you be willing to do that? Because that
Yeah.
is what made me go, wait a minute. So after I graduated from high school, I took a year of college classes through ATI. And one of my
Yeah.
jobs was to go step by step through the basic seminar and the advanced seminar and prove the points from scripture. I
Mm.
couldn't. I couldn't
Wow.
find scripture to prove it. And so deadlines were looming. And so I started just grabbing pieces of scripture, like this piece of verse and that piece of verse, and sticking it in there. And my teacher never stopped me or never corrected me. And I was like, is this how this got proved in the first place? And so I think that was one of my huge, like, this is really all very wrong.
Yeah.
And so I would just encourage somebody who is still stuck in that, like, look up the verses, read the verses around them, read the chapters around them, and do they really say what he says they say?
Yeah. And I guess it goes back to what we talked about earlier. It's like, if you go up to someone with fundamentalist or extremist beliefs and say, look, you're wrong, all that you've thought is terrible, that's not going to change anyone's mind. Maybe it's going to reinforce it more so, because they're going to get that reaffirmation from the people around them. But if you ask a question like that, and you ask these probing questions, and ask the questions that maybe we've been discussing today, then you're going to be able to slowly unravel these beliefs and deconstruct, to use that term, someone's beliefs, or allow them to begin questioning and deconstructing for themselves, which is the only way people will be able to really get out without forcing them physically and mentally to do so, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So to bring this to a close, Christy, it's been lovely speaking, but do you want to just give a little plug to how people can obviously listen to your story a bit more? Where can they find your podcast? Where can they buy your book? And what are you planning in the future?
Sure. So I have an older podcast that I had for 4 years called Looking for the Real God, and you can find that anywhere you listen to podcasts. Then I have a new one that just came out. It's got 4 episodes right now. They drop every other week, and it's called Religious Rebels, and you can find that on YouTube or on your podcast platforms. I published a book this summer also named Religious Rebels, which is on Amazon, and it has ebooks or Kindle Unlimited or paperback copies, and it's available worldwide. And then I do have a website, ChristyLynneWood.com, that I don't do a whole lot with anymore, and a Substack. So it's all just, if you look up Christy Lynne Wood, you'll find all of me. I'm all there.
Excellent. And because of your name, it's going to be easy to find you, isn't it? Christy Lynne
Right.
Wood,
Yeah.
So that's been
But I had
amazing.
to
Christy,
adopt my middle name. Yeah.
Yeah, do so, because my name's spelled Austen. I jump out. It's like, it's easy to find me on Google, so, I can't hide anywhere. But Christy, how great has it been speaking? Thank you ever so much. Obviously for this first interview for my channel, and getting to just ask these questions has been really enlightening with someone who's obviously been through a lot and has a lot of knowledge, both on scripture, theology, and the lived experience of such a high control group. So thank you very much. And we'll end it here, folks. So if you want to, please subscribe to Christy's channel. And I've got links in the description as well. And also, if you want to join the conversation, do leave a comment. I'm sure both of us will be happy to reply at some point. But everyone, all the best. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.